Welcome to Paulogia Live, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians live from the Paulogia studios here in Nova Scotia, Canada, where the time is currently, what time is it? 1:17 a in the M, 1:17 in the morning, Sunday night. Everyone's got to be up for work on Monday, but what am I doing? I'm starting a live stream that's probably going to be a long one. So I'm hoping there's some night owls among us. Maybe we've got some people from overseas who have normal, maybe this is a normal time for you. I don't know. Let everyone know what time it is for you in the chat so we can get a sense of who's being responsible and who's being irresponsible. I'm clearly being irresponsible. But I've been saving something for a while now that I wanted to, I've been wanting to cover for a while. So a lot of you know, if you follow my channel, that I like to cover arguments about Jesus' resurrection. It's a particular interest area of mine, and I've become somewhat known for that. I have had the privilege of interacting with some well-known Christian scholars on this front, with Dr. William Lane Craig, with Dr. Sean McDowell, with Dr. Frank Turek, with Dr. Andrew Loke, Dr. Mike Lacona. These are, Dr. Gary Habermas. Like, there's no bigger names in the realms of the resurrection apologetics than those gentlemen. Why are there no ladies? Well, that's a Christian thing. But because I do that, I came across a few months ago a live stream from someone named G-Man. Now, some of you who've been around the atheist spheres for a long time will recognize that name. Apparently, this is an individual who was relevant on YouTube like a decade ago or so, or something. I'm not sure. Back then, I was a Christian. And back in those days, there was online community, and G-Man was part of it. And apparently he's still making videos. This was a new channel that I'd never heard of before, but I saw it there, and it was a video specifically about the resurrection, so I had to click on it to see what it was all about. Now, again, G-Man's arguments have nothing to do with the fact that his relevancy ended long ago. This is a man who this very night was talking about bionic dance. Now, I know bionic dance, met her in person, interacted with her frequently, a friend of mine. She has not made atheist content for years, and yet this is still a person that G-Man is pointing to, so I don't think his fingers are really on the pulse of the apologetic, counter-apologetic scene. But all that said, and thank you for the super chat, Todd. Hey, my alerts actually kind of worked. That's cool. We're going to probably read super chats at the end, but for this one, we're gonna jump in. We'll see. We're doing late night. We're hanging out. It's gonna go till 3 in the morning my time. Thank you for the super chat, Todd. G-Man is never particularly relevant, infamous, perhaps not relevant. This is what's weird, is I don't really know because I was a Christian. I would have actually been on G-Man's side back when all that was happening. Now, you may have noticed that I titled the video something along the lines of the worst resurrection arguments that I've ever seen. Now, that's a bit hyperbolic. I have been among casual Christians who don't think about their faith very much and don't really have much of a defense of what the resurrection is. But this is definitely the worst among anyone I've ever seen who is actually trying. And this was clearly a man who was trying very hard and thought that he was doing a great job at defending Jesus' resurrection. So if you're up for it, if you'd like to join me on this adventure, let's take a look at G-Man and his defense of the resurrection, and we'll go through it together. Again, Christians, I'm not projecting that this is one of your good arguments. I know that it's not. I've talked, as I mentioned, talked to many well-respected scholars in this area, but that's fine. We're going to go with, tonight we're going with low-hanging fruit. And partially, I think one of the reasons why we do this is we're not here to laugh. We can laugh. We're not here to for any of that. These are actually things that Christians might say. And it's good for us to know what to say in response to those things. And if you are a Christian and these are the kind of arguments you're putting forth, it's probably also good for you to hear why these are not good arguments. So, without further ado, hopefully the sound is working all right. We will give it a go.
Then it is today I want to talk about Jesus and the resurrection.
Going to give us a little more.
It's an important topic, especially if you're a Christian, because at some point in your life, you're going to end up having a conversation with somebody over, them asking you the question of how do you know that Jesus Christ rose from the dead? What proof?
This was the question that once I decided that evolution was a thing and that Jesus also believed, though, that there was Adam and Eve were specially created. What could I hold on to from the Bible? And one of the most important questions, he's absolutely right. How do we know for sure? How can we tell what's the evidence that Jesus was resurrected? Super important question. He's right there. Good start.
And evidence do you have that he rose from the dead? Why do you believe he rose from the dead? And we as Christians have got to be prepared to answer such a question. The good news is throughout the centuries, we Christians have been able to answer that question, which is why we still believe to this day.
Good news.
But you got the people out there who don't really read and study their Bibles and don't know how to answer this question. And that's what I want to kind of get into today. So before we get started with the topic, I want to just throw a few things out there. First and foremost, why do we believe that George Washington is the first president of the United States?
That's a really good question. Why do we believe that George Washington was the first president of the United States? Well, one of the reasons... Oh, where's that screen there? Pardon me. One of the screens is reasons for example, we can go to the Library of Congress. Oh, wrong one. We can go to the Library of Congress and we can take a look at, they have preserved 77,000 documents written either by George Washington himself or his contemporaries like Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, many others, contemporaries, that people who lived at his time who wrote these things. So we have 77,000 documents. Not to mention all the newspapers that were available at the time that would have given us news of how the election went. There would have been overseas news telling us. We just have literally hundreds of thousands of things. Now, this is obviously from just a few hundred years ago relative to Jesus's story, but this is how we know G-Man. We have tons and tons of documentary evidence from people who liked him, from people who didn't like him, people who are impartial, from his own hand. This is super good evidence. So I think we're justified in saying that that George Washington was the first president of the United States.
Why do we believe that Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation? Why do we?
Super good question. One of the reasons we can do that is we can go, and the Emancipation Proclamation itself has been preserved by the National Archives. So you can actually go and check to see who signed it. And one of the names there, actually I think it's the only name there. I'm Canadian. Forgive me if I get parts of this wrong. But Abraham Lincoln's name is on it. So we don't have to even have any other witnesses as long as we can roughly authenticate that this is the actual document. Boom, there's his name, along with, of course, thousands of other documents of the time to let us know. These are the ways that some ways we know history.
Believe it. Why do we believe William Shakespeare existed? Why do we believe
William Shakespeare existed? Well, oh, this is the wrong one. I jumped the gun. William Shakespeare. Again, William Shakespeare. There is actually some dispute among scholars about the exact nature of William Shakespeare, whether or not there was a one author or many, whether people were using a pseudonym, whether perhaps there was a front. But we do actually have 6 different documents. Oh, I actually did. Sorry, I have the right one. It's late, guys. It's gonna be bumpy, but that's all right. So we actually have 6 documents actually signed or allegedly signed by William Shakespeare, and those can be compared, and they have been many times, along with all the other attribution. So William Shakespeare, I'm actually willing to concede there's a little bit less evidence for him than for Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. As a playwright, that makes a little bit of sense that there's a little less attribution. But we do have some pretty good evidence, including firsthand testimony from William Shakespeare himself, or the person who was claiming that name. So some evidence, but whether or not that person existed actually doesn't affect whether we enjoy the plays, and whether the plays should be taught in school, and whether these are excellent artifacts in English literature. The man existing himself in history doesn't actually affect what he's best known for, ironically enough.
Believe any historical figure existed. What rules are we using to determine whether or not we know that a historical figure existed? We talked about this.
So one thing about history is that historians don't really have a lot of rules that they all agree on. This is actually one of the things about history, unlike science and physics where they've got, man, these are the rules, that's how we decide. Everyone kind of comes up with their own. There's a few that are like general guidelines, like earlier documentation tends to be better. Enemy attestation tends to be friendly. Enemy attestation can be believed maybe more than your own interpretation. If there's multiple attestation, that's better than single attestation. If there are details that can be corroborated from multiple different sources that we're not collaborating, those tend to be good things. Anyway, there are some rules, and these aren't, but they're not hard and fast rules because every historian kind of adopts their own. So, G-Man, I'm not sure what you're talking about for the rules of historicity, but I'm hoping that you will tell me what yours are so that we can evaluate this Jesus evidence claim based on what you say.
In the previous video, where we talked about whether or not Jesus actually existed. There are rules of historicity that must be followed. And so,
I think sometimes in this video, it seems like he's a little bit confused about whether he's talking about whether Jesus existed or whether Jesus rose from the dead, because those, of course, are incredibly different questions. So I would actually grant. Usually I grant for the sake of argument that Jesus existed, because I feel like the case is fine with that happening, and it's not unreasonable that there was a real person on which the later legend sprung up and grew. That makes sense too. So, G-Man, we're not worried about whether Jesus existed, or at least you shouldn't be if you're talking about the resurrection.
In order for someone to say that a person did or did not exist, or an event in history did or did not happen, there has to be rules that has to be followed across the board for any person that's ever existed.
There are no across-the-board rules of history, but I'm excited to hear what you think they are.
And you'll notice that a lot of the enemies of the faith will not want to engage in such a conversation, because when they try to make their argument,
here I am,
that, let's say, Jesus didn't exist or he didn't rise from the dead, those arguments can be used against anybody else in history. So
I think where he's going for this, again, he's stuck on the historical thing at the moment. Sometimes people want to say, well, the evidence we've got, if you don't accept the Jesus evidence, then you also don't accept, name the historical figure, Julius Caesar or whomever, right? Frankly, that's okay with me. I actually think that we accept a lot of the ancient history stuff based on something that's pretty flimsy. But the good news is that, the actual real life habits of Hammurabi doesn't impact my life, and no one is attempting to make federal laws based on the teachings of Hammurabi. So what? If I found out tomorrow that Julius Caesar didn't exist, my life changes not. So this is not a great argument, at least not for someone like me who is not a historian. And neither are you.
So it's a good idea to be intellectually honest on a topic like this, because it's an
Or all the time. All the time would be good.
important one. Because a lot of us know that if Jesus never rose from the dead, we're wasting our time.
Yes, that's why I investigated it so thoroughly and why I stopped becoming a Christian.
So we had better know how to answer this question on how do we know that Jesus rose from the dead? Is there evidence for it? And the answer, the good news is yes. And as a matter of fact, there's
good news, it's yes. We can skip to the end.
Probably more evidence for Jesus rising from the dead, ladies and gents, than it is for a lot of the historical events that happened. As a matter of fact, I would dare say that there's more evidence that Jesus existed and he rose from the dead than there is for there being a Holocaust.
Did we all hear that? G-Man says that there's more evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ than for the Holocaust. Holy cow, man. Really? This is where Christianity is at? Well, at least this is part of why it puts it in the worst category here. Flabbergasted. But there's so much evidence for the Holocaust. Tons of documents. And you can actually find a lot of these documents online. The Nazis themselves kept a bunch of documents about who they're killing and when and how. All kinds of documents are available. We have the Diary of Anne Frank, which is far more reliable than Gospels. They have all kinds of finding at Auschwitz. They have internal Nazi writings themselves to the final solution. There's photographs. Wow. If you think, I don't care how much evidence you think there is for Jesus' resurrection, this is a bad, bad, bad look. Please do not ever say that again. Please, just, I cannot emphasize how terrible that choice of example was. Please don't do that.
I'm just telling you, and when we go through all of this, you're going to see what I'm talking about. All right. So let's just go over some facts regarding Jesus of Nazareth.
Facts.
Number one, and these things have to do towards, him dying and everything. And that's that Jesus died by crucifixion.
Okay. Jesus died by crucifixion. Everyone who lived died. So I usually grant this one.
Jesus was buried in a tomb.
No. We don't know if Jesus was buried in a tomb. That is...
Death caused the disciples to despair and lose hope.
We have no idea how the disciples reacted. That is...
believing that he was dead. Okay? Jesus' tomb was empty a few days.
Jesus' tomb was not empty as far as we know. Because we don't know if he had a tomb.
Days later. Where do I get this information? Initially, that I'm reading from there. It comes from my Bible.
Maybe I should change my jingle to just G-Man smacking his Bible. This is how we know. He's not even denying it. This is how we know. For the Bible tells me so.
Okay? If a person is going to engage in a conversation with you about whether or not this is the claim, they have to be able to go to that to get the claim.
Are people denying that that's the Christian claim? Are people denying the Christians' claim that Jesus rose from the dead? Because we do. Now, if you are sophisticated enough to be arguing that it was the claim of the early disciples, which I don't think is your sophisticated level, I don't accept that either. You can go check out my recent work with Dr. Bart Ehrman. I also did a response to Dr. Lydia McGrew recently regarding the same topic. No, there's no reason for anyone to accept that the early disciples were making this claim, but I think you're actually just referring to Christians. So I don't know who you're arguing with, but yeah, that's pretty bad.
Before they can even start to talk about why they believe or why they don't believe or anything like that. You gotta have the claim.
All right, you can test us on the claim.
Okay, so when they try to tell you to put this down, that's lame, because this is where our claim is. The question,
that's where your claim is. The question is, what were you going to say?
the question is do we have evidence for the claim that we're making?
Right. So yeah, so the Bible is useful to document the list of things that you want to say are the claims, or however, whatever thing you want to put forward. But the claim is not the evidence. You now need the evidence to corroborate what the claim is. So I don't understand what your argument and what your complaint is, that people don't accept the Bible at face value. If you listen to my latest video with Dr. Bart Ehrman, William Lane Craig put forth a very similar silly thing. And Dr. Ehrman rightfully observed that if you just take the Bible at its word, why are we even talking about evidence? Why are we talking? Then that's just what happened. If you think the Bible is 100% reliable, then stop talking about anything discrete or what happened to the apostles or what their attitude was or that there was an empty tomb. You're just accepting at face value. So stop talking to me unless you're talking to me about why that document is reliable. Not this evidence dance that we're about to do.
And again, the answer is yes.
Okay. The answer is yes. Ta-da.
Okay, so what is the evidence that we have for the resurrection of Jesus Christ?
Please tell us.
What is evidence first? I know this gets a little bit boring for people to hear, but if you're going to engage in a conversation with somebody about this, you have better make sure you get your terms and definitions down correct before you.
I'm totally on board with that. Every debate, if you're debating with someone, defining terms should always be the first step. Otherwise, you're talking completely past each other. This part I'm on board for, G-Man. Let's hit it.
You actually talk to anyone about this. Most of the people who are against Christianity want you to basically actually physically be there and actually see the event with your eyes.
No, that's not what I want. I guess that would be great evidence for me if I observed it. But even no matter what I observed, I would need to actually also evaluate what I'm attributing that to and whether it was really what I think that it was. No, we're not all looking for a time machine to go. That would be cool. But it seems like the God of the universe could come up with something else.
If they wasn't there to actually physically see the event happen, then it didn't happen.
This is the Ken Ham. They can't. So few Christians are able to do the outsider test of faith, where they can, for even just a minute, put themselves into a non-Christian mindset. This is just literally what Ken Ham does. If anyone argues against six-day creation, were you there? And that's like a defeater. We weren't there to watch it. So, G-Man, no, it's not. I trust that it's not any secular person that you've actually listened to and absorbed what they're trying to tell you who wants to actually be there. We want corroborating evidence because we will get to it, but eyewitness testimony is terrible.
According to them. That's not what they're going to say to you. What they're going to say to you is that they're not convinced that enough evidence have been provided to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. That's what they.
Wow, you were listening, because that is correct. I have not seen enough evidence to convince me that Jesus rose from the dead. That is actually correct. Well done.
To say, but what they're really saying to you is that because they wasn't there to physically see it, they don't believe it.
No, anytime you are just merely, instead of taking your interlocutor at their word, if you are ascribing other motivations or ascribing other, epistemologies to them just on their behalf, then you're not addressing what they've said. You're just avoiding the question. This is why this video is terrible, because it's avoiding. He acknowledged he knows what the stated objection is, and he's just avoiding the stated objection to cut to this bad motives. Well done in ineffectual arguing.
That's why we got to go over some terms and definitions. So if you hear them say that no one's ever provided any evidence for this, make sure you remind.
That is probably a statement that a non-believer shouldn't say, is no one has provided any evidence, because the Gospels themselves actually are at least evidence that someone at some point believed it. So I don't think that's good. It's hearsay, and we can get into all that, but it is some evidence. So hopefully that person was being hyperbolic, or perhaps you misunderstood. There is some evidence, but there is not sufficient evidence, as we will see.
Remind them about what that word means. Evidence, the available body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or a proposition is true or valid.
I'm not sure which online dictionary he was reading that from, but that's not bad. That's not terrible. I could roll with that.
What are the available body of factual information we have on?
Thank you for putting that in finger quotes.
On this topic, indicating whether a belief or whether or not our belief is true or valid. Let's just keep the word proposition out of there and talk about whether or not our belief is actually true. Do we have good reason to believe that Jesus of Nazareth actually rose from the dead? And the answer again is yes.
Oh,
we have overwhelming evidence to actually believe this. And it's convincing evidence. Okay. You look at the number of people out there who claim they don't have a belief in a God at all. And you look at the different religions, and then you look at how many people actually believe he rose from the dead. It's mind-boggling. It's not even close.
Wait, so you want to take a show of hands? So show of hands tells us which view is correct. So in a few years, I'm not sure what the projection is. I think it's maybe a few decades, when the number of people on the planet who are Islam outweigh the number of Christians in the world, then Islam will suddenly become true because they have more people who believe it. Is that how we do things? You know that more people would have thought the earth was flat at some point, and more people thought that the earth was the center of the universe at some point. What the general populace believes has no bearing on what's true, and what you or I believe has no bearing on what's true. So that's terrible.
So let's go over this evidence that we have. Is there evidence that Jesus actually rose from the dead? I have notes here, guys, so that's why
he's got notes.
Look over here. And I'm going to enjoy this first piece of evidence, and I'm going to show everybody, because it's the best form of evidence, even though we're told repeatedly, over and over and over again, that it is the weakest form of evidence. And today, as I did on S.J. Thomas's YouTube channel, and as I've done on Brother Veckel's channel, and I've done on other people's channels, I'm going to show everybody why the argument that they use against what I'm going to say is wrong, all at the same time while explaining it. And that is eyewitness testimony.
Eyewitness testimony. Of course, two things. May as well get to this first right away. So we got eyewitness testimony. So the Association for... You can find so many resources on the non-reliability of eyewitness testimony. I chose just to pick one at random, the Association for Psychological Science. This is a organization where you have to have a PhD in psychology to even become a member. This is an article they put out in order to try to summarize some of their scholarly opinions for people. The myth that eyewitness testimony is the best kind of evidence. It's been historically among the most convincing, but it's always been bad based on a lot of different things. But the reality is memory doesn't record our experiences like a video camera. It creates stories based on those experiences. Hey, here comes my puppy. And again, one of the great, if you really want evidence about this, Elizabeth Loftus is an excellent researcher who gave an excellent TED Talk and several other lectures that you can find free on YouTube about how memory changes. There's been so many studies. For example, there's the study where people are supposed to count how many times basketballs are passed, and then they're asked afterwards, after how many basketballs were passed, did the man in the gorilla suit come by? And most of the people deny that there ever was a person in a gorilla suit until they're actually shown the tape afterwards, and they were so focused on something they didn't do it. We're going to get to some of the 9/11 studies later on, assuming I'm still awake by the time we get that far in the video. Eyewitness testimony is unreliable, not because people are lying, although there is, of course, the chance that someone could be deliberately lying with eyewitness testimony as well, but because memory is not as reliable as we want. That's why so many cases now are overturned based on what the casual person would call hard evidence, like fingerprints or DNA, those kind of things, video footage, even though in a court of law, that's actually called circumstantial evidence. Anything that isn't direct evidence, like testimony, is called circumstantial. But really, that's what we're looking for. Those are the things that corroborate eyewitness testimony. Then we've got the entire problem that we have no eyewitness testimony of risen Jesus. The Gospels do not claim to be eyewitness testimony. Two of the Gospels, even the most strident evangelical will admit, aren't written by eyewitnesses. Neither Mark nor Luke were eyewitnesses to the events of Jesus' life, so those aren't eyewitness testimony. Matthew and John, unless you're an evangelical scholar, scholars don't think that those are the names of the people who wrote them or that they're based on eyewitness testimony. Matthew's just copying Mark. If he was an eyewitness, why is he copying the work of a non-eyewitness? This is all silly. The only person, we have exactly one person in all of human history who gives us their name and tells us that they saw Jesus alive after he was dead, and that is Paul. Now, Paul, at least 3 years later, maybe 5 years later, maybe longer, saw what he describes as a vision. Even what he describes is not the body of Jesus, because the body of Jesus is already ascended. So, like, was there another second coming? No. What Paul saw was a vision. So we actually have 0 eyewitnesses. So anything you say, G-Man, even if you could make a case for eyewitness testimony, which you can't, not based on actual research, show me the paper that tells us that eyewitness testimony is good and reliable. It's just not the consensus view. We don't have eyewitness testimony for that to even come into play. So that's bad.
Eyewitness testimony is powerful because if a person witnesses something happening, it's going to affect them in a way that's going to affect other people in society.
That makes literally no difference to whether what they saw is true. The fact that the thing that they think they saw or actually did see or whatever affects other people has no bearing on the truth claim. Sorry, because you can lie and affect other people. You can be mistaken and affect other people. Affecting other people is nothing.
If you witnessed a murder, you're going to be shaken by what you've seen. It will cause you to call the police or try to be quiet about it. Lie to cover up what you actually see. But it's going to cause you to behave a certain way if you witness something. And that's in the negative sense. If you witness something in the positive sense, it's going to cause you to behave a certain way.
So I assume the G-Man thinks that he has some way of telling us how these eyewitnesses, alleged eyewitnesses, were behaving. We don't. The only clues that we have are in the books that make the claims that we're trying to corroborate. We don't have corroboration for how they're behaving. For all we know, none of the disciples stood up and ever spoke about Jesus again, or ever thought that he rose from the dead. Now, I think we have reasonable evidence to say that a couple of them did. I think we have reasonable evidence to say that Peter went on, and that John later went on, of the 12 disciples. And I do think we have some evidence that James, the brother of Jesus, was involved in the church. But we have no firsthand recordings at all, or even secondhand recordings, of what those men believed or said or did. And as for the rest of them, history goes completely silent. We have no idea that these people, they all may have gone back to fishing the next day. You don't know that their behavior changed. You have absolutely no idea.
And according to the scriptures, a large crowd of more than 500 eyewitnesses saw the risen Jesus Christ at the time of the Apostle Paul writing 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 6.
No, the case is actually better than you just stated it. Paul is repeating an early church creed that was established long before he wrote, well, at least somewhat before he wrote 1 Corinthians 15. But Paul can't corroborate any of it, because he literally says, this is what other people told me, and I'm repeating it to you. Paul doesn't know, and nothing in that creed is what Paul can attest to, except for when he tacks his own name to the list at the end. Now, these 500, that's in literally one place, this alleged 500. So what we have is a story of 500 witnesses. We don't know the name of a single witness. We have no information about what they say they saw. For all we know, they saw something floating in the sky. If even this happened, I don't even think it happened. I honestly don't think the 500 people saw anything. We have one reference in one verse where a man is quoting a nursery rhyme from 20 years earlier. If that's the best you got, you got to try harder, because I'm not convinced.
Let's go into what 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 6 has to say. Again, if you're going to try to refute the claim, you had better know what the claim is first before you...
Okay. If I'm going to try and refute the claim, I got to know what the claim is first. So I don't have it in front of me. Got to take my word for that. I used to have a lot of the New Testament memorized, so let me see if I can remember 1 Corinthians 15. So, okay. I passed on to you what I was going to receive as of first importance, that Jesus died for your sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. Then he appeared to Cephas, then to the disciples, then to 500 men and brothers and sisters all at once. I'm sorry, it's a little choppy. Guys, I'm just trying to remember my Old New Testament. Some of whom are alive, though. Most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to the... then he appears to the disciples. Then he appeared to the apostles. Then to me. Then last of all to me, as one abnormally born. That is roughly what that passage says, G-Man. You're looking it up right now. I was able to approximately quote it to you off the top of my head. Do I understand what the claims are or not? This is a ridiculous requirement, because most people should just look it up. You shouldn't have it memorized. This is the internet age. We look things up so that we know we're getting them correct.
You try to refute it. Okay? 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and it's verse 6. Let's get into this here.
So
and it says, after that, he was seen of above 5 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain unto this present, but some
He's
have
using
fallen
King
asleep.
James
Meaning
for
there
that.
were people who were still alive at the time of the Apostle Paul writing this.
No, there were people who, according to, even if you believe the story, there were people who were alive at the time when the nursery rhyme, I'm calling the creed a nursery rhyme to be a little bit dismissive and derisive, but it was a creed. When the time that was circulated and memorized, that's when the people were alive. Although actually some people dispute that. Some people say that that's an interjection by Paul. So you know what? I'm going to take that back. G-Man might be correct on this. Some scholars would agree with G-Man on that. So that's fine. But the fact that these people were alleged to be alive, we don't know their names. We don't know what they saw. We have absolutely... This is just a claim that they were alive. The claim that they're alive is no different than the claim that they saw something. We have no corroboration in any source, not even the Gospels. Why didn't the Gospels record this 500 witness story? I know you can say maybe selectively it shouldn't be, whatever, there's excuses. But man, that sure seems like it was important if it actually happened, right? No, I don't think it happened.
Saying that they saw the risen Christ. Let's do a little bit of background so that you guys can understand what was going on and what the scenario was.
Okay.
Christianity was not popular back then. Okay.
Yeah, no, there was like only 12 dudes who believed it.
Jesus was popular amongst his followers and amongst his enemies, but anyone who was associated with him and believed the things that he believed, their lives were in danger.
And not even that. Good grief. So the notion that everyone's lives are in danger is way overblown by Christian apologists. Oh, thank you for the super chat. You can go to Jerusalem and Passover and ask around. Oh, I'm not sure what that's in relation to. But okay. Thank you, Grays174. If you add more context, I will happily figure out what that's supposed to mean. Where were we at? I don't normally answer. I normally answer super chats at the end. My apologies. I lost my train of thought there.
Okay, it was best if you were quiet and.
Oh, right. The myth of the Christian persecution. So, Christian persecution did happen sporadically in isolated places at isolated times. Yes, Jesus was killed, but Jesus was killed for political insurgents, not necessarily for what he believed. The earliest Christians, we know that they're spreading the stories, and we know that this whole church grew. Even if you take the Acts at its word, there were not police on every corner forcing, checking to make sure people don't accidentally believe in Christianity. We think we know that Nero in 64 AD was blaming Christians for a fire that he set. At least that's the story. If that is correct, then the fact that those Christians were persecuted had nothing to do with what they believed at all. It only had to do that Nero needed someone to blame. Christianity was not illegal up until 300 years later. And then for a very brief time, it was illegal. And then it was made legal again. And then it was made the official religion of the Roman Empire. So I encourage you, G-Man, to read Candida Moss's book about the myth of the Christian persecution. Yes, some people were persecuted, but not in the way that you think that it happened, and not in the veracity it happened. It's not like this was happening to everyone. Paul and some of the people, and every time we have the record of Christians being persecuted, at least those early ones, it's because they were causing trouble. It's because they were going into towns and causing disruptions. It's not because they were quietly praying in the corner and someone dragged them out. The charges of these things were for causing problems in the marketplace, or things, of those natures in general. Yes, I'm not going to walk that back. There were There are a couple of times where they wanted people to pray to certain gods, and Christians didn't want to do that. But in general, this is way overblown. This is not every single Christian was in danger for their lives. And particularly, we have no idea what the eyewitnesses were doing. I stand by that. We don't know what Bartholomew was doing, what Thomas was doing, what Matthew was doing. None of the people you can name. All right, that's me getting heated on that one. Sorry. The martyrdom thing drives me a little nuts.
Those days, because if they found out that you was a follower of Christ, they would kill you.
No, that's not what happened. Or please tell me what the evidence is for that. Someone pointed me to it, because that's not what happened.
During these particular times, or deeply persecute you.
Deeply persecute you? What does that even mean? And in what context and what evidence do you have for that, G-Man? What is your evidence?
Because of what you believe regarding Jesus Christ, right? The Apostle Paul writes, a large crowd of more than 500 eyewitnesses saw the risen Jesus Christ. Now, a lot of times...
Again, that was Paul repeating what he was told, if you believe his own words. And yeah, we don't know if there were 500 people.
You'll hear people say the eyewitness testimony is the weakest form of evidence. That's only if you can prove that the eyewitness or the person that claimed they saw the event is lying.
All right. So you heard it first. Eyewitness testimony is reliable unless you can prove that someone's lying. We don't have to prove that the person's telling the truth. The person making the claim, no truth burden there. G-Man has it completely reversed. We have to prove that you're lying. Now, if you can prove you're lying, well, that sure damages the testimony, doesn't it? But that's not the way it works. Eyewitness testimony can be wrong for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with lying. You can be mistaken. Your memory can, well, I guess they all fall into the category of mistaken when you're wrong. But you could have been mistaken from the start. Your memory can change. You could have been primed, asking leading questions in an interview. That's why they're so careful now with the way these interviews go and recording the questions, because the questions an officer asks you can actually lead your testimony toward a certain thing. So, for example, there's a study where they would talk to people, what speed do you think the cars bumped into each other? And you say, or what speed do you think they crashed into each other? Same footage, but when you say crashed, people think it was faster. When you say bumped, it was slower. These are eyewitness testimony is problematic, not just because of the lying. And also, a lot of times, you can't prove that someone's lying if they're the only witness, for example, unless there's a detail that you can falsify. That's why you judge that's why you see whether there's corroboration, and you look at the character of the person and reasons they may have to, perhaps their eyesight's not great, or their hearing isn't great, or they have reason to believe one way or the other. I'm spending more time on this than I should, but eyewitness testimony is not it's not considered amazing unless you prove they're lying. That's not the way the courts work. I'm glad you are not a lawyer, and it's evident that you're not a lawyer.
You notice that the enemies of the faith are always assuming that the eyewitnesses are not telling the truth, perhaps.
No, I assume nothing about the eyewitnesses because there are no eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection. At least none that have recorded anything. Sorry. What we have is, at best, hearsay. And that's generous. Oh, and hearsay, not admissible in court generally. For good reason.
Mirage or a hologram or something like that. That's
silly. I don't know why some people... So some non-believers actually go ahead and just accept that the Bible is true, but try and come up with naturalistic explanations for why everything in the Bible would be true except for the fact it's a miracle. That's a little bit weird. If you're a skeptic who does that, let me know in the comments. Maybe there's good reason to do that. I don't see good reason to grant the Bible details. At least not all of them. Not the ones that, again, by the rules of historicity that we can't verify.
nonsense. Okay, for the other reasons that we're going to get into in a minute. But the fact of the matter is, there were 500 people.
That is not a fact.
That witnessed Jesus Christ arising from the dead. And these people were deeply persecuted for their faith that they had in Jesus Christ. Some of them were beheaded.
You can't know that. You can't possibly know that. Even if what is written in the Bible is true, you can't know that they were being persecuted.
They were crucified. The Apostle Peter, we all know, was crucified upside down, at least according to tradition.
G-Man dislikes Catholics. At least that's what I recall. I don't know why he all of a sudden said, according to tradition, which is really just Catholic tradition. Peter, so some of you may have seen me talk to Dr. Sean McDowell, whose doctorate dissertation was on the martyrdom of the apostles. He is considered at this point to be the modern day leading expert in the field of martyrdom. In his book, Fate of the Apostles, he very explicitly says that it is highly doubtful that Peter was crucified upside down. We have next to no evidence for that, but G-Man has heard it somewhere, according to tradition. At least he acknowledges that it's tradition as opposed to any good evidence, and accepting his word. So, but he throws the word fact on there, right? That's not how history is done.
Some of them were boiled in oil.
No, the story we have of someone being boiled in oil is from like 3rd or 4th century, and it is of John the Apostle, who G-Man believes wrote the book of Revelation and the Gospel of John and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And in that story, the disciple John, son of Zebedee, I believe, survives. He gets dipped in oil, and it's just like a cool bath for him. And he gets out and then goes on to live to an old life. So the only person we know about the oil boiling made it through just fine. So it wasn't much of a persecution, was it?
Tortured, especially when you get to the Roman Catholic days, when some of them was put through the Iron Maiden.
Okay, well, the Roman Catholic days is hundreds and hundreds of years later. So I don't know what that has to do with anything.
Christians were deeply persecuted for believing on the Lord Jesus Christ.
Let's grant that is true. It doesn't matter unless they were eyewitnesses. So where's your evidence that any eyewitness was persecuted? Yeah, we've already talked about the exceptions that I grant, but those were expressly political murders, not theological murders.
Now, the Apostle Paul wrote 1 Corinthians chapter 15 in AD 55.
That's pretty close. Good job.
Okay. Most of the eyewitnesses were still alive at the time, and they told other people about the miracle. If you don't believe,
how do you know that? That's speculation.
You go read the book of Acts and you'll see what I'm talking about.
If I don't believe you, read the book of Acts. The book of Acts is the claim, G-Man, as you talked about earlier. It's not the evidence for the claim.
Remember, a lot of them were standing there and they watched Jesus ascend to the Father. It's right there in the book of Acts. So now we got a problem here now. We got these people making a claim, and they're saying that we saw Christ rise from the dead.
Who is making this claim? What are the names of the people making the claim, and where do they make this claim? The only person who gives us their name and tells us they're making a claim is Paul. And he didn't see Jesus's pre-ascension body.
How do we know that they're not lying? Because even in the midst of sudden death and being tortured,
we don't know if they were lying or not, because we don't know that any eyewitnesses were making any of the claims that you say they were making.
These people still believe the things that they believe. Now, some people are going to be like, well, Muslims do the same thing. They fly airplanes into buildings, and Muslims do this and Muslims do that. Muslims never saw Muhammad ascend to Allah. Muslims never seen Allah in the sky or nothing like that. And
Christians never saw Jesus. At least none that recorded that they did.
It's not their claim. The claim of these people is that they saw the risen Christ, and they shared this with the known world at the time. Some of the people that was with Jesus at the time that witnessed the resurrection was Peter.
Okay, we don't have any writing from Peter, even if you accept that First and Second Peter were written by him, which very few people do. Those books don't describe being a witness to anything.
John, Mary Magdalene, the mother of Mary, the mother of James.
Mary, the mother of James. Usually it's Mary, mother of Jesus, but she was technically, I guess, the mother of both of them. So that's interesting. I hadn't noticed that before. We don't know what those women saw. We have stories about what those women saw written 20 years after they would have seen them. And if it was the mother of Jesus, she would have been like 70 or 80, even if she gave birth to Jesus very young. Would have been very old by the time, for those standards, by the time the Gospels were written. We have no idea what any of those women saw.
The Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus. A lot of you was like, well,
yeah, that was a post-ascension body, and he describes it as a vision. And even Acts describes it strangely, but Acts is not what Paul saw. So we don't know.
Tell me someone who saw him after he was after he ascended. Well, the Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus.
Why would a skeptic want to know someone who saw him after he ascended? Because clearly, whatever kind of Jesus form he may have after ascension wouldn't be a resurrected body. Like, let's say you just believed in ghosts. Like, that's not Jesus rising from the dead, and that's just Jesus's ghost. So that would be a weird ask. I don't think a skeptic really ever asked you that.
His name wasn't even, the Apostle Paul, but before his name was Paul, his name was Saul, and he was persecuting.
I used to think that too. But turns out that it's much more likely that Paul went by both Paul and Saul all the time, and he just used the one name depending on who he was with. So Saul being the more Jewish form, Saul being a Pharisee who sometimes interacted with the Jews in the Old Testament law, but also being a Roman citizen would have normally gone as Paul in his Roman interactions. So it turns out, scholars tell me, including Bart Ehrman corrected me on this once, that probably didn't change his name. That's a total aside, but a kind of bit of a funny tradition that probably isn't true.
The church. And his claim is that on the road to Damascus, he had an encounter with the living Christ. And he said,
nope. Paul never mentions Damascus. That is only found in the book of Acts. None of Paul's letters mention that. Paul describes, when Paul uses his own words, he describes it as a vision.
Saul, why hast thou persecuted me? Is it hard enough to kick against the pricks or whatever, right? And I'm sorry. He says, Saul.
In the NIV, at least in 1984 NIV, which is the version I memorized, it's hard to kick against the goads, which is a funny word. G-Man said bricks. Is that what it is in the King James? I don't know the King James that well. It's a funny verse regardless.
Why dost thou persecute me? And he says, who are you? And he says, I am Jesus of Nazareth. It's hard enough to kick against the bricks. I think I always butcher that when I try to quote that. I can do better at that. But the point of the matter is that the Apostle Paul,
as I said before, these are really just things that we should just look up as opposed to trying to remember off the top of our heads, probably.
Paul had an encounter with the risen Christ. He wasn't dead. He was sitting at the right hand of the Father. Yeah.
Wait, he wasn't dead. He was sitting at the right hand of the Father. So you're admitting that what Paul saw was at least an ascended being, right? Not his resurrected body anymore.
We're told that this is not a good reason to believe in the resurrection. So let's go on. And by the way, the claim that he rose from the dead, and I'm not going to read it, most of you should know this by now, it's in Luke chapter 24, verses 1 through 9. And it explains how Jesus' followers found out that he...
Not just in Luke. Of course, the claim is in Mark 15:16, in John 26 and 27. No, that's Matthew 26 or 7. I think John 20:21. Again, don't go by me because I've lost all my reference memory. These are things one should look up. the point here is that actually Luke is probably the third written gospel. Mark was written first, probably Matthew second, and then probably Luke third. So, G-Man, you should probably go back to Mark on these things, just if you want the earliest, most reliable versions.
He had been resurrected. And I know a lot of you try to make arguments that that there were contradictions in the resurrection account. I'm going to save that for a part 2. Matter of fact, I might cover that in this video. If I don't, I'll do it in a part 2 because it's really easy to debunk that garbage.
When he says debunk, he means harmonize. Harmonization is a process where you take seemingly conflicting details and you come up with plausible, ideally plausible details that can make those two things be in harmony versus being in contradiction. So, for example, the number of men / angels who are at the tomb seems to vary from account to account. Was it 1? Was it 2? Was it 3? Well, it's easy to say, well, if there was 3 all along, the other people just only mentioned one of them. Just like, you know, there's a dog in my room right now, which you can't see. But, you know, if someone talked about Paul and his dog being on the stream, that would be correct. But if you only mentioned Paul being on stream, also seemingly correct, because you just didn't care about mentioning the dog. These are the kind of harmonizations that you can, of course, do with like contradictions in your favorite sci-fi franchise, like Star Wars or Marvel, for example. When things seem to contradict, you can come up with ways to harmonize these things. That doesn't mean that they are not still contradictions. It just means that if you really want to believe that they're all true, you can. I don't think, and for that reason, I don't think contradictions are a great argument for a Christian, because if you're committed to believe it, harmonization works, even though John and Mark have Jesus crucified on entirely different days. That's fine. Special Passovers is, I think, one of the things. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Moving on.
But the point of the matter is that they try to argue that there are contradictions in the Gospels. One Gospel says that this woman was there. This Gospel says that these 2 women were there. And what they don't understand is that the Gospels are people telling the story of the resurrection, right? 4 different times, right? And if...
No, not right. What you don't understand, G-Man, was that Mark was written first, that Matthew copied Mark in many places, word for word in the Greek, but notably changes occasionally some words here and there. These are not the kind of changes, these are not copying error changes, these are theological changes. And Luke does the same thing. Luke makes changes. If you read one of the Gospels, Jesus was suffering intensely. If you read another Gospel, you change a couple of words from Mark, boom, Jesus isn't suffering. So it's the worst of both worlds. They are literally, you can demonstrate synoptic problem. They copied each other. So they're not independent sources at all. These are not different eyewitnesses. But while they're copying each other, they make changes. And in those changes, that's the contradictions that you betray. That whoever wrote the Gospels were willing to make the story fit the theology that they wanted. That's the opposite of what you would expect from an eyewitness. John makes all kinds of changes based on theology. And of course, most scholars now, I'm not sure if it's climbed to most, but a growing number of scholars will at least test that John, the author of John, had copies of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or at least Mark, to go by. So again, these are not 4 independent sources. These are 4 people telling the same story, just trying to change the theology for their audience or for whatever they wanted. So no, this is not what you see. And again, I get there's material that's in one that's not in the other, but that's not the resurrection accounts or the crucifixion accounts. The crucifixion accounts are what we care about, not the crucifixion accounts. The resurrection accounts are what we care about. And in those, they're copying. No question.
Everybody's story says the exact same thing. You can tell that these people collaborated with how the story went. But
No, yeah, you can tell that they colluded is the word, not collaborated. They colluded by using the same source. You kind of admitted it there.
If you actually get these people telling the story and they're slightly off from each, that actually shows that they're telling the truth. And
now it changes that they were deliberately altering details because they didn't like the way the other person told it.
Anyone who's been in law enforcement and understands how investigation goes understands this.
Yeah, when Jim Warner Wallace talks about this, he betrays himself because the first thing he always says is, well, when I get to a case, J. Warner Wallace being the former cold case detective, who's been on Dateline more than any other cold case detective, the first thing he does is separate the witnesses so that they can't collude. That is not what happened for the Gospels. There was incredible collusion.
You got three people, oh, they're all saying the same thing. Looks like they collaborated about what they're going to say.
Yeah, Dr. Mike Licona gives an example about this, and he admits it where G-Man doesn't. At least these better educated apologists give better explanations. He describes it as, so because the Gospels were written in Greek, and all the characters in the Bible would have been speaking Aramaic, it's even worse than just the fact that we see the collusion of the word-for-word copying, because theoretically, if they were independent witnesses, they're all translating exactly the same way. Can you imagine if you found 4 different people who were actually translating from one language to another in exactly the same way, even if they had a written testimony about what the first person said? No one translates exactly word for word. These are problems. If one wants to say these are Gospels or independent sources, they are not.
Let's just rephrase the questions a little bit, see if we can get them to go off on what they said or whatever. You know what I mean? The apostles died for their faith.
No. Well, maybe one did. Maybe.
Did not die for a lie. That's another argument that they made. They try to argue that the apostles was willing to die for a lie. They was willing to be tortured for a lie. A person wants to be boiled in oil for a lie.
Again, we've been through all that, but the boiling oil story, if G-Man is accepting that as an actual true story, then he's just granting stories, legends from hundreds of years later that all serious Christian scholars reject. His credulity is through the roof.
That's nonsense. No one's ever existed and was willing to die for a lie like that.
Again, we don't have a record of these people dying for what they believed. We have a couple of people who died because they were associated with a movement that got them in trouble. There was at 0 times do we have any record of anyone being, any eyewitness being given a chance to recant. So we don't know what they believed. We don't know what they were willing to die for. The fact that they were putting themselves in harm's way, again, says incredibly little. People think they can get away with stuff all the time, and most of the people weren't being persecuted.
Okay, again, they try to use a Muslim example, saying that, you know, that because we Christians don't believe in Allah, that they was willing to fly the airplanes into the buildings, therefore, you know, they died for a lie. But we Christians, that's not the claim that the apostles and the early believers made. The claim that they made was that they saw the risen Christ, and they
Who makes that claim, G-Man?
refused to renounce their faith, no matter how hard they try. Now the question is, why isn't this convincing enough?
Why isn't this convincing enough? So, 4 obviously colluded accounts from people who do not claim to be eyewitnesses, who are providing at best hearsay, none of which should be allowed in a court of law. Why isn't that convincing enough? Really? And that's all to a miracle claim, where a miracle, no matter what you believe, a miracle has a low probability. And even if you actually had eyewitness testimony, you'd have to say, well, maybe they were mistaken or maybe they were lying. Those are always on the table. Wow, you don't know why that's not convincing to me? Then you are completely enabled, G-Man, to put yourself outside of your faith for even a second to an outsider test, because you would not accept similar evidence for other claims.
To have a skeptic believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And I want to throw a couple of ideas out there to be able to show you why this is the case.
Okay.
We have to remember that God is not the only one in the scripture, that Satan is there too. So I believe that Satan has an invested interest in trying to debunk the resurrection, because he knows that if you can't give that most people who unfortunately don't read and don't study and isn't under a pastor or isn't anything like that, that they're not going to know how to answer some of these questions.
So wait, you're saying that the reason that myself and other skeptics don't believe is because a non all-powerful, Satan is not all-powerful, he's not all-knowing, he's limited in space and time, can't read our thoughts, at least according to most theologies. That person is somehow stopping me from believing that hearsay about miracles is more likely than not. That's the hearsay about miracles should be convincing, and it takes a supernatural being to do that. Can't it just be not convincing?
Questions are dishonestly made, because these questions that they present to you about whether or not the resurrection happened has nothing to do with the rules of historicity.
What are your rules of historicity, G-Man? Because so far you seem to just accept every tradition that comes along, no matter when it's made, no matter how many scholars tell you that it's terrible. Your rules of historicity seem to be whatever confirms your story is what you accept. That's not a good rule of history.
If you don't believe me, ask them. Put their feet to the fire and say, okay, what rules of historicity are we using? And then
put my feet to the fire, man. I laid some out earlier. In all my videos I talk about the rules that I accept, and they are generally granted by men like Dr. Gary Habermas or Mike Licona, experts in the resurrection. We actually kind of do normally, other than the criteria of embarrassment, which is embarrassing, we normally play by similar rules. You're the one that seems to be playing by open credulity.
Them stay on it and follow those rules, because they got to prove to you that these historians are wrong.
No, that's not the way it works. You don't have to prove that they're wrong. The Gospels are making a claim, and for us to accept a claim, you need sufficient evidence. If you just go by what you can't prove they're wrong, G-Man, you must also believe in aliens, and also believe in Sasquatch, and also believe Elvis rose from the dead. Or didn't die, or whatever you want to think about Elvis. The burden of proof is on the person making the claim, my good sir.
Okay? A lot of them...
And I'm sorry I'm repeating myself, but it's whatever time it is. It's 3:30 in the morning for me. Neat.
Using the scientific method. And I'm going to tell you something. I didn't come to the conclusion that George Washington was the first president of the United States by going to his grave and digging him up, finding his bones, and doing a DNA test.
Okay. How would digging up the bones and doing a DNA test on George Washington, wherever his body is, prove that he was the first president? How is that supposed to work? Is there a genetic marker of some kind that presidents have? I don't think you've thought that one through, man. If I can genetically identify George Washington's body, that tells me nothing about the careers he's had.
That's not how I believe that George Washington was the first president of the United States. I learned that George Washington was the first president of the United States from reading books.
Okay, that's how you learned it, but that's not why historians accept it. Historians accept it. I already spoke about it. They have 77,000 independent documents talking about George Washington. You have 4 incredibly dependent documents making weird claims about Jesus. Those are not on par, man.
Why is it okay for them? Why is it okay for them to come to the conclusion that George Washington is the first president of the United States from reading a book?
No, because that's not how anyone... Well, it may be how individual humans who don't care much about history come to learn it, but that is not why historians who wrote the book make the claim.
And not going out there and digging up his bones and doing a DNA test on his bones.
I still don't understand what that would do. How would George Washington's DNA tell us he was president?
They're not going to do that. They're going to take that claim on faith. They don't even know that they're taking.
Take the claim on faith? Your definition of faith is different than mine. They take the claim because they have sufficient evidence from sufficient scholars. Even if they're not looking for it themselves, which they totally can. They can go to the Library of Congress. They can investigate all those documents. They can probably get some testing done if they really want at certain levels. Oh, man. Yeah. They're not apples and apples here, man.
That claim on faith. Or did Abraham Lincoln actually sign the Emancipation Proclamation? They wasn't born when it happened. How do they know that he actually did it?
Again, that's a incredibly mundane claim that a certain person signed a document that we still have and his name is there. That's a pretty mundane claim versus someone rose from the dead. Yeah.
Are they going to invent a time machine and go back there and actually witness it happening?
And take some DNA from Abraham Lincoln that somehow would tell us? I don't know how that would work.
What are the rules of historicity that we're using?
We've laid it out over and over. What are the rules of historicity you're using, G-Man? Because it just seems to be...
Are we talking about credible sources? Are we talking about scholars? What are we talking about? What are we using to come to the conclusion that an event actually happened? See, a lot of people wrongly believe that faith, the faith that we Christians have, is a blind faith. Somebody says it to us and we believe it. And
weirdly, I'm actually with you on this. The trouble is that so many Christians define faith as what covers over the gap between the sufficiency of evidence and their accepting of something. I've asked a lot of questions about this, and a lot of Christians will take that definition of faith. So you'll have to forgive non-Christians for taking Christians at their word. You need to do a better job in your own community of getting people on board with this evidential take that you want to take. Because we're not wrong to say that there's a lot of Christians out there who do just go with the blind faith definition. So I'm with you that that's not everybody. But it's confusing for us, so get your act together.
You're wrong. We have a ton of evidence to back it up. We have the eyewitness testimonies.
You don't.
Of the 500 that saw Jesus arise from the dead.
You have a story about 500 people in the same story with the other things.
We have the apostles to this very day that we don't have any of the enemies of the faith to show that any of them have told a lie.
You don't have any evidence to show that they told a lie because we don't have any of the words of those apostles to validate whether or not what they said is true. We don't know what they were saying, man. You can't say, I don't know if Billy Bob told a lie when we don't have a stitch of an idea of what Billy Bob was saying. So provide that first, and then we can evaluate whether the apostles were lying.
Because you got to explain Fox's Book of Martyrs.
No, Fox's Book of Martyrs was written like in 1560-ish. That's like a century and a half after the events. We don't have to explain how someone came up with fanciful stories of how people 1,500 years earlier may or may not have died. Don't have to explain that. That's just fan fiction.
You got to explain the historicity of the church and how long we've been persecuted.
I do agree with the first part. You do have to explain that the church exists. That is one piece of evidence that is solid, and you absolutely have. The Christian church exists, and if anyone denies that, just stop talking to them. What did you say the second part was? Oh, and how long they've been persecuted? Again, read actual books by actual scholars about the level of persecution of the early church. I'm not saying there wasn't occasionally some persecution, but it's not this steady state hunting that you're making it out to be.
For believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and preaching against this ungodliness that's going on in the world. They don't do that. This is the lazy answer that we get from them 100% of the time. I'm just not convinced.
How is that a lazy answer if that's the true answer? Perhaps a person can be unconvinced due to a lack of investigation. Sure, that makes sense. I haven't investigated what's the topic? I have not investigated. I'm totally blanking. I don't know a lot about astronomy, for example. I haven't investigated a ton in astronomy, so there's lots of things I may not be convinced of there because I don't know a lot about it. That's some ignorance. But G-Man, do you think that someone like myself, you probably do think that someone like myself haven't investigated the resurrection? I have. I've read all the books. I've probably read more books on the resurrection than virtually any Christian you can point me to. And I've been fortunate to actually have interactions with a lot of the authors of those books. I've investigated, so that's not the fact that I'm still not convinced was not because I was lazy. I've been busting my butt on this thing.
They never show why the Apostle Paul is a liar. Why?
I don't think the Apostle Paul was a liar. I think the Apostle Paul was mistaken.
Peter's a liar.
I don't think Peter was a liar. We don't actually have any first person writing of what Peter said, so it's tough to know. I do think that Peter probably did believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but I think Peter is mistaken as well. It's just those two, so it's not like it's a whole chain of people that have to be mistaken. I think just those two.
James's mother's a liar. Mary Magdalene.
James's mother. All right, that's Mary. We don't know what Mary said. We don't.
Yeah. Was a liar. They never go through the trouble of explaining all of that because
I try. I have massive playlists on my channel. Go check them out.
They're depending on you to be ignorant and not do no research. And I got something else I want to show you. You can actually prove that that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead in a court case.
In a court case.
Simon Greenleaf was challenged to do that. And I've been dying to show everybody this. So I want y'all to check this out. And I want you to tell me what you think about what would happen if the resurrection was actually taken to court. And you had to be honest about the evidence that was being presented before you.
He's been dying to show us this, everybody. This has got to be it.
Dr. Simon Greenleaf decided to put Jesus' resurrection on trial by examining the evidence. Greenleaf helped Harvard Law School gain widespread credibility. He also wrote the 3-volume legal masterpiece, a treatise on the law of evidence, which has been called the greatest single authority in the entire literature of legal procedure.
Okay, so Simon Greenleaf was a lawyer who was born in 1783, lived to mid 1800s. So this is when we're talking about here. This is the best legal case is from Simon Greenleaf, a gentleman from hundreds of years ago, back when the legal system was very different. So when they're showing all these modern cases and books, these are standard of evidence that we deal with now that have nothing to do with back then. I'm not saying he wasn't a pioneer on evidence. He probably was. But that quote that was just on screen there about whether he was... let me see if I pulled up that quote. No, I didn't pull it. But the quote that G-Man just had on the screen there, I actually went and tried to find where that quote came from. It came from the back of a book. I'm sorry I didn't... So, no, the fact, you know, they're saying, well, Simon Greenleaf was one of the best evidential scholars of the day. Well, that came from the back of an apologetics book. The back cover of an apologetics book, not some legal historian, not from some legal book. An apologist called Greenleaf a legal expert, which is very similar to me outside of my field declaring that someone else... You can't just declare someone to be an expert in a field that you have nothing to do with. And that be the pull quote that you use to demonstrate that they are. If someone from the legal field was saying this, it'd be one thing. But no, an apologist said it on the back cover of a book. That's nothing. We're going to get to Greenleaf in a bit, a little more details. But I encourage you, G-Man, to actually look these things up and investigate these things. And I'm actually going to be going to some actual Christian sources for this stuff, not Wikipedia. I pulled up Wikipedia just because that's sometimes where you find some of the other references. But I'm going to be showing you Christian sources about Simon in just a minute.
The U.S. judicial system today still relies on rules of evidence established by Greenleaf. Greenleaf wondered if Jesus' resurrection would hold up in a court of law. Focusing his brilliant legal mind on the facts of history, Greenleaf began applying his rules of evidence to the case of Jesus' resurrection. The more Greenleaf investigated the record of history, the more evidence he discovered supporting the claim that Jesus had indeed risen from the tomb.
This sounds very similar to the stories of J. Warner Wallace or Lee Strobel, two men who also claimed to have investigated the case for Jesus and have been incredibly convinced by it. Two men whose books I've read probably multiple times at this point and find entirely unconvincing. So the fact that one person finds something convincing really doesn't mean much, but let's keep going.
He documents his case for Jesus' resurrection in his book, Testimony of the Evangelists.
What is this evidence?
So what was that evidence?
What was it?
Greenleaf observed several dramatic changes that took place shortly after Jesus died. The most baffling being the behavior of the disciples.
Wow, this is what G-Man started with. The amazing evidence that this Simon Greenleaf had that Jesus rose from the dead is that within the story where Jesus rose from the dead, some people changed their behavior. Does Simon have any evidence that they actually did change their behavior? No. Just the story where the rest of it happened. I don't think that would be holding up in a court case. As we mentioned, the Gospels are hearsay. Hearsay is not admissible in court. I don't know how Simon can possibly think that that would hold up in court.
He argues, it would have been impossible for the disciples to persist with their conviction that Jesus had risen if they hadn't actually seen the risen Christ.
That's just ridiculous. You can't... It's impossible for someone to behave in a certain way if what they're saying isn't true. Like, if you want to say it's unlikely they were lying, that's one thing, but it's always possible that someone is acting on being mistaken. It's always possible that someone is wrong. So to declare that what they were doing was impossible is a completely non-false... You can't prove that it's impossible, as G-Man might say. That's a ridiculous statement to make.
Applying his own rules of evidence to the facts, he accepted the resurrection as the best explanation for the events that took place immediately following Jesus' crucifixion.
Like, literally, this was it. So G-Man's playing this amazing video that he just couldn't wait for us to see. And all it was someone from the 1800s being impressed that in a story, some men changed their behavior in a way that he thought was consistent with a miracle. Really? That's what's impressive?
Many other legal experts, including former Chief Justice of England, Lord Darling, agreed with Greenleaf's verdict on the case for Jesus' resurrection.
Ooh, Lord Darling. So Lord Darling is also from the 17 or 1800s. Like, these are men from hundreds of years ago in Britain being impressed that what they think is true about the resurrection would be appealing in a 1700s British court. And I'm supposed to be excited that our evidential standards would be met. This is the closest you can get.
Darling writes, "There exists such overwhelming evidence, factual and circumstantial, that no intelligent jury in the world could fail to bring in a verdict that the resurrection story is true."
No intelligent verdict, way to qualify it, could bring in a verdict that the resurrection wasn't true. So, innocent of being guilty of resurrecting, I'm not. Anyway, yeah, I'm not really impressed by this 1700s Lord's opinion either. So basically, you've got two opinions based on one bit of hearsay.
Simon Greenleaf, to some, was an agnostic, and to others, he was an atheist.
No, that is not the case, G-Man. You've done terrible research. So here we have, well, you can find from the Wikipedia article that he was not ever an atheist. He was an Episcopalian, a Christian his entire life. You don't have to take Wikipedia's word for it, because you can actually go and find the actual paper, like I did, that documents his life and tells us that. But not only that, G-Man, you may not like the peer-reviewed paper on his history. You can find Christian sources. For example, this Inspirational Christian Blogs, who chastises other Christians for falling for this terrible false narrative that Simon Greenleaf was a Christian his entire life. At no point was he ever an atheist or agnostic. He didn't ever change his mind because of the legal book he wrote. He had a conclusion already, and using whatever legal evidence that he found in his day job, decided that affirmed what he already believed. So that's someone changing their mind isn't evidence either, just like me changing my mind isn't evidence that Christianity is false. But you need to check out your sources a little bit better if you're going to try and claim that you know. I'm not going to be impressed by your arguments when you're wrong on a basic fact that you can check.
And when he decided to be honest, not be a liar, not operate under a bias, not try to...
He was a Christian the whole time, man. That was a bias.
...do this for entertainment, and he decided that he was going to be honest about it. He put the resurrection to the test, and he came to the conclusion that the resurrection is just as historical as anything else that's ever happened in history.
I'm guessing his book has more details, but the video you just showed, which you were so impressed with, had one detail. That there's a story about people whose behavior changed in ways that are entirely explainable.
Again, what are the rules of evidence? What is the rules of and what is the rules of historicity? That burden is not on me if you are the one that's telling me that this event is not historical.
No. What we are saying, as you pointed out earlier, we do not have sufficient evidence to believe that it is true. The burden of proof is on the person claiming that something happened. That's just the way this goes, man. I'm sorry. It's not on me to say that it didn't happen, because that's not the claim. I'm saying I'm insufficiently. Maybe that's why you get so mad about this whole sufficient evidence thing, because you understand that that keeps the burden of proof on you. Sorry about that, but you got to work harder.
Not historically true. You must first start off and say, okay, these are the rules of history. If you choose not to, and then I present the rules of history, the rules of historicity, and I bring up how you got to have, scholars, and you got to have
scholars. Okay, all of my opinions and all my bases are based on scholarship, and the mainline scholarship, and the scholarship of not just any evangelicals like you would go to, but evangelicals as well as non-believers. I have a much broader consensus for my opinions on these than you have.
People who have done research, and they've done it honestly, and you got to talk about
people who have done it honestly. So you want to be able to characterize people who come to different conclusions you as dishonest. Is that what I'm hearing?
The behaviors of the disciples and all this other stuff. If I bring all that,
the behavior of the disciples and other stuff is not a rule of history, and it's not even a fact of history.
But then you got to work with that, and you got.
Okay, so I got your rules of history. So let me get you clear. You gotta have scholars. Okay, I'll bring scholars.
Explain to me why that's not the case. Oh, you can't just blindly say, "Oh, eyewitness testimony is the weakest form of evidence."
Well, I brought research papers and people who've dedicated their whole lives to this in peer review to show why eyewitness testimony is unreliable in general cases in lots of different ways. I think you'd also need, if you're trying to say that eyewitness testimony is reliable, please bring that research.
That's only true if you can catch the person lying.
No, that's not. We went through that enough. Again, you don't understand burden of proof.
And we have allowed the enemies of the faith to get away with that lazy answer for too long.
Well, let me spare you this. I could even grant you that eyewitness testimony is reliable and go from there, because you don't have any. First, show me what eyewitness testimony you've got, and then we can talk about whether it's reliable.
From here on out, if somebody approaches you and they say, well, I'm sorry, but eyewitness testimony is the weakest form of evidence. Do you know how bad, and during the OJ trial, they would have loved to found somebody who actually saw what actually happened there that day?
I'm sure any trial without witnesses would love to have eyewitnesses, but that doesn't mean that the jury would find that person compelling, or that what the person would have to say is reliable. Anytime you could have more evidence and less evidence, that's good.
You would have loved that. Don't give me that garbage. A lot of the people that argue against eyewitness testimony are not even talking about why that would be true and what scenario that would not be true.
Well, human nature is human nature. So the faulty memory, bias, the ability to have your opinions changed and lead, the fact that every time we recall a memory, we're actually recreating the memory again and making alterations. I mean, that's not scenario specific. I mean, there are certain scenarios where that can make it worse, or make it not as bad. But what scenarios are you talking about when we don't have any eyewitness testimony?
A lot of them don't know what they're talking about. The fact of the matter is that Jesus did rise from the dead.
That's just a fact. If that's a fact that Jesus rose from the dead, why did we have this whole half-hour conversation? I know I've been talking for a longer than half hour. G-Man talked for half an hour. If it's just a fact, man, if you just accept it because the Bible's true, then just own that. That's not evidence. You just believe it.
100 eyewitnesses saw it.
No, we have a story about 500 witnesses seeing it from someone who can't corroborate those witnesses.
Many of his disciples witnessed it.
We don't know that. We have stories about that. And that's what we were trying to see the evidence to corroborate, and you didn't provide it.
And all of them understood what would happen if they went out into the world and preached the gospel.
Even if I grant you that, we don't know what any of those 12 who allegedly saw things, what they were up to. They might have gone fishing. They might have returned to fishing, for all we know. Show me what confidence we can have that they actually put themselves in harm's way, and then we can have this discussion.
Remember this, and I love S.J. Thomason because she's one of the people that constantly repeats this. Look at the courage of the
Yeah, that's not an endorsement.
apostles. When Jesus was getting ready to be crucified at Golgotha, the place of the skull, when he was getting ready to crucify, where was his disciples?
According to the Gospels that said that Jesus rose, they were gone. But that's, again, these are the details we're looking to corroborate. We're not trying to explain all the details of the story we don't believe. Show us that the details are true. Give us eyewitness testimony about the details, and then we'll talk.
Where was his followers? They were hiding. They were running.
You don't know that.
You were nowhere to be found. Peter denied Jesus Christ 3 times. What happened after he rose from the dead and they saw him rise from the dead and watched him ascend to the Father on the day of Pentecost? The Spirit of God came upon these people. What happened? Totally different behavior.
You don't know that. We're almost done, guys.
They didn't care if they got crucified. They didn't care if they were boiled in oil. They didn't care if people laughed at them, scoffed at them, mocked them. They didn't care because they knew what they knew. They know what they saw. And at the time that he wrote 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 6, a lot of those people were still alive, and a lot of those people still going out there.
What were their names? What did they have to say? What did they have to say about what they saw? What did they have to say about what they endured? Were any of the 500... Did they stick to their story for the 20 years between? You can't tell me any of those details.
Talking about how Jesus wasn't dead and how he rose from the dead.
Let alone whether you might have actually found people who claimed to be part of the 500, because that would sure be a great way to get yourself ingratiated in the church. Who's like checking to make sure that the people who said that they were there and in the 500 that day, that they really were. Lying or mistaken are on the table. But we don't even know what they claimed, so we don't even need to get to lying or mistaken.
Again, what are the arguments against it? I'm sorry to tell you this, guys. There are no arguments against it.
None. All the playlists on my channel, they don't even exist.
So you can disprove the credibility of all 500 people and all of the apostles. Why do you think they attack the Bible so much, guys? By doing that, they're attacking the claims too. And that's why a lot of them can't even articulate what the claim is.
I think I can.
All right. So they'll say things like, oh, how do I know that the eyewitness wasn't seeing things or whatever? Well, one of the things that we also talked about.
Someone who is worried about that would actually be granting that the claims are true if they're trying to explain the claims naturalistically. So that's a contradiction.
One S.J. Thomason's YouTube channel, which I thought was brilliant. We talked about historical events that impacts us and how if you're going to make something up like that, you know, those events isn't going to impact you the way as if you actually did witness these things. Like, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. 9/11. How many of you know where you were 9/11? I know where I was. I was working in Liberty State Park. I got a bird's eye view of what happened. In the same way,
let's talk. We're almost done, guys. But let's talk about 9/11. So there are lots of studies regarding 9/11. Here's one of them: long-term memory for the terrorist attack of September 11, flashbulb memories, event memories, and the factors that influence our attention. So there were a number of studies done where people had the foresight within the weeks and months after 9/11 happened to get groups of people together and have them record describing what they were doing, where they were, all that kind of thing, all the details about what was happening to them when they learned about the events of 9/11. Then they would go back 1 year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, and have the people try and recount it again. And it turns out people are terrible at being consistent year over year about how they learned about 9/11. In this particular study, they did 1 week, 11 months, 35 months after the assault. And for example, the rate of forgetting for flash memories and event memory how much you remember slows year after year. The strong emotional reactions cited by the memories are remembered poorly, worse than non-emotional features. So this is the exact opposite. This study is finding the exact opposite of what G-Man, and I think he said it was SJ, are alleging, that because when something emotional happens, we remember it better. No, the studies tell us the exact opposite. The studies tell us, specifically around the 9/11 example that G-Man himself brought up, people do a poor job of remembering something that traumatic.
That when the disciples saw Jesus rise from the dead, it was going to impact them.
I mean, if that happened, it would impact them, yeah. But we don't have a record of how they were impacted to even evaluate whether that's a factor we should consider.
It changed them, caused them to behave differently. They no longer cared whether or not the authorities would kill them for being identified with Jesus Christ. That is something that needs to be taken into consideration when we're talking about this topic. Again.
So we need to take into consideration the details of the story that we're trying to prove, but assume that the details of the story are correct, and then try and explain those. That's what your gist is.
You're going to run into two different types of people when talking about this. The first person you're going to run into is going to be a person who's going to be interested in the information. They're going to digest the information. And then they're going to be brutally honest with you about what they believe about it.
Is that me?
We run into a lot of people every day that will tell you, well, I just don't believe that. And that's fine.
Okay, it's just fine. Cool.
But when you're going back and forth in a debate with the second type of person, these people are not telling you the truth. And that's the denialists. These are the lazy people who refuse to do any real research, read any books, and actually look into the actual topic. They will deny that the event happened without giving you any good reason.
I admit that would be frustrating, and I'm sorry if you're trying to debate such a person. I trust that I have not put myself in that lazy category. I spend a lot of hours listening to and reading details about the resurrection, including the best books available on the topic. So I may be very, very wrong, but I trust that I'm not lazy. And if I am being lazy, call me out on it. Let me know what I should be doing differently.
To this very day, the very best reason they give us is, I'm just not convinced. The second best reason is, this has not been proven to be reliable.
I mean, I wouldn't use those voices, but that actually is what it comes down to. I'm not convinced because I haven't seen evidence that corroborates that claim. And I don't just accept the claim on its word because I don't think that the Gospels are reliable. Please explain to me why those are bad reasons to not believe. You have not made your case for someone like me who has investigated a lot of the evidence. Maybe not enough, and that's why I keep listening to, as I mentioned off the top, many hours ago when it was we started, that I'm constantly on the lookout for new evidence for information, which is how I found this stream in the first place, and hoped I would find something of substance. But I trust you will agree that what we found was not substance. What we found was someone who's credulous, accepts everything it is at the word of the Bible, can't take himself out of his own belief system for 5 minutes to give it an outsider test of faith, and then is frustrated when people tell them the real reasons why they don't believe and refuses to accept those even as the real reasons. That is, in summation, why I think that this is the worst defense of the resurrection that I've ever heard from someone who actually thinks they're trying. I probably have a couple more sentences to finish off.
Literally what they say. But if you were to sit down with them and have an intellectual conversation with them, doesn't matter if they're college grads or whatever, and you talk to them, let's talk about this historical event and whether or not it actually happened. How did they come to the conclusion that this event didn't happen? What rules of historicity are you using? Almost 99.9% of the time, there's never an agreement on whether or not, on the rules of historicity on whether or not a historical event happened.
Well, it's my understanding from historians that that is generally true, that the disagreement within historians is largely epistemological and how we come to these kind of conclusions. So, yeah, that's not my fault that history is a field where historians sometimes play with different rules, and why I would agree with you that if you're going to debate someone, you should agree with the rules up front.
Don't believe me, start a conversation with somebody about this, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Because the first thing Beckel says when he's talking about this with some people, whether it's a resurrection, something in the Bible, a doctrine.
I don't know who that is.
What scholars do you have that support you? And the first.
What scholars do I have support me? So on a lot of my claims, I have Dale Allison, who's a Christian. I have Mike Licona, who's a Christian. For some of the evidence, the McGrews agree with me. On some of the evidence, others agree with me. And we'll get to someone closer to my channel in a minute.
First thing we're looking for is credible scholars. We didn't ask you for heretics. We asked you for credible scholars, people that are respected across the board in the church.
Okay, so G-Man, you've limited your acceptance of scholars to people who agree with you, who are not heretics. That means that they agree with your position. So literally, you cannot be presented with evidence that you will accept because you've defined evidence as things that agree with your opinion. That is not intellectually honest, good sir. Intellectual honesty means that you accept evidence based on other criteria, regardless of whether it supports your conclusion or not. I've looked at many scholars who disagree with my conclusion and incorporate their opinions and work because they have done the work. That's not what you're doing.
You notice that they never bring none of them up.
I brought
Bart Ehrman had to come to the conclusion that Jesus Christ actually existed. And
okay, this is interesting. So Bart Ehrman came to the conclusion that Jesus existed. So are you putting Bart Ehrman in the category of scholars that you will accept? Because if so, please go to my channel and watch the interview I did with Bart where he graded my resurrection hypothesis with a scorecard. And we went through point by point. Dr. Bart Ehrman went through point by point of all the things that I put forth about the resurrection, and he gave me a glowing review. So if that's an acceptable answer, forget all those Christian ones, I got Bart. But I also have all those Christian ones who don't agree with me on conclusions, but whose details we agree with. Those are the scholars I have. Who are your scholars, G-Man?
Simon Greenleaf, an agnostic to some and atheist to others.
Simon Greenleaf, the dude from 1850 who was always a Christian his whole life. And you, for some reason, think he was an atheist who had some experience with law and felt confident that law would vindicate his opinion. That's the scholar you've got. Do you have someone from the last couple centuries?
came to the conclusion that the resurrection is just as historical as any other event that's happened in history. In fact, it was so impactful on him that he became a believer.
He was a believer before he started.
He became a born-again follower of Jesus Christ. I, nor any other believer, ain't under any obligation to spare your feelings on this particular topic. And I want to let people know something else too. I am not interested in debating anybody in this community regarding this topic. Now, if there are any arguments against him
fine
rising from the dead, I would love to hear them. If you make a YouTube video, you're not giggling and laughing, calling me a joke, cussing and all this other nonsense, and you make a serious video and you put the link in the comment section that you made a video response, I might respond to you.
This probably isn't the video for you. I opened it by poisoning the well by saying that this was the worst argument I've ever heard. So that's probably not the most fair assessment. Although feel free, if you think that anything here is worth addressing, you probably don't, to address it. I would rather point you to my main channel, where I have entire playlists on the resurrection. I'm not giggling or laughing, and I'm responding not to someone like you, but I'm responding to the best scholars in the field, and they take me seriously enough to respond to me directly. If that's not good enough for you, I guess that's fine.
It just depends on what you say. If you're just gonna make a video and say, "Well, I'm just not convinced," don't waste my time. I'm not gonna waste your time. Don't waste mine. I'm not interested in doing it. Okay, I'm gonna take questions in the comment section, then I'm gonna end the video.
All right. So I think we're well past wasting time. When I started, it was 2 hours ago. It is now 3:15 in where I live, and tomorrow is Monday when I have to work and other people have to work. But that was fun. Let me see what we got for super chat type questions, and then I'm not sure how much other chatting we'll do. I know we read a couple of these up front, but we'll get to them again. Thank you so much, Todd, who writes, G-Man was never particularly relevant. Infamous, perhaps, not relevant. Well, we'll see. He did make this one video. I guess we can go back to whatever he was doing. Perhaps he can update both his YouTube sources and his scholarly sources. Greg's 174 writes, you can go to Jerusalem on Passover ask around. Oh, good. An ask around the 500. So this is actually a serious question then. Thank you, Greg's 174, or comment. I have a whole written debate with Dr. Andrew Loke, a theologian. We've debated this specific topic about whether there were group appearances of Jesus, and a lot of it goes around the logistics around the 500. You theoretically could. Most people didn't travel that way. I know that for Passover and things, people did go to Jerusalem. The trouble is, again, we don't have the names of any of the people. We don't know, for example, that there wouldn't have been people who were taking advantage of Christians and just claiming to be one of the 500 when they weren't really, because of course we're talking now 20 years later when this story has been circulating that there were 500. No one was checking wristbands at that point to see what, who was in the group, who wasn't. We don't know what these 500 saw. We don't know if, for example, if we did have testimony about what these 500 saw, would it be something more like what Paul saw, which was a vision? Or would it be more like what the gospel claims, the Gospel of John, for example, where it's a more physical interaction? We just don't know. Dale Allison, a renowned resurrection scholar and devout Christian, agrees that this whole 500 notion is pretty vague and non-attested by any other early Christian source. So, given the hour and the time, how long the stream has been going, I would point you to my debates, actually, which are on this channel. I have verbal versions of at least my portions of the debate for you to check out. And I would love for you to leave a comment there, and I will look for them to see if you have any feedback for my take on the 500. But thank you so much for those, Gregs. I do appreciate that's totally a valid point. I just don't think it's a great point because most people didn't do that kind of travel, and it would be very impossible to verify. Maybe the 500 eyewitnesses. Oh, this is again by Todd. Maybe the 500 eyewitnesses were documented in the Gospel of Peter, right after the bit with talking and cross coming out of the tomb. I love that one. Yes, it's the other Gospels that were written shortly after these other the Gospels that we know, the four. There's some pretty crazy details. There's Peter goes ahead and paralyzes his daughter and unparalyzes his daughter or reparalyzes her. There's a talking cross, all kinds of crazy details. So maybe, unfortunately, we actually know the 500 aren't documented in those, even in those crazy Gospels. The 500 isn't attested there. Perhaps the 500 documented in Gospels we've lost. But that, when something's lost history, it's lost history. Gnostic informant. Oh snap! It's 2 a.m. here. Well, it's now 3:15 here. I don't know what time it is for everyone. It's late and it's Sunday. I get it. But I just really wanted to hang out. My sleep schedule's all messed up. So we'll see how this goes. Thank you so much though, Gnostic informant. Always appreciate you. Marco Wall writes, walking on water. How is this this reproducible by those strong in the faith? Ham Hovend. Should be the easiest miracle to prove God. Greets from Germany. Thank you, Marco. It's interesting that if you take the book of Acts to be correct, according to Jesus, he promises the apostles that they're going to do even greater miracles than he does. Even if we take all of the books as true, that's not what we see. We don't see the apostles doing greater miracles in general. So what happened? What happened there exactly? And of course, there's cessationalists who think that miracles stopped after the time of the apostles, and that's one of their outs for not being able to reproduce today. But why is Jesus leaving us hanging? Why can he not at least show us that he exists? Why can he not give everyone, an annual update? Just letting everyone know, hey, I'm still here and I'm alive. People could still not worship him. We know that Satan, according to the Bible, even the demons know that he exists and they shudder. So demons can have 100% proof that God is real and still reject him. I don't understand why humans can't also reject Jesus. It doesn't mess with free will, but you're preventing many people who would at least be able to evaluate the evidence. So that's the bigger problem. Why can't Jesus at least tell us he's around? Do it. Vaguely Agnostic writes, thanks, Paul. Well, thank you, Vaguely Agnostic. Appreciate. Grimrock writes, this was a long one. It was. And it's not getting any shorter. Greg's 174, did you ever see the McGrew and McGlatchy testifies video? I saw portions of it. So I've had also private conversations with Testify. Because they were private, I'm not privy to everything. I would ask you to go look at. I feel like I was misrepresented in certain ways. They also feel like they were misrepresented in certain ways, and that's all fair. I don't think that what was said really changed their position. And I think if you look at Testify's tweets that happened shortly afterwards, that you will find that Testify himself was not comfortable with everything that was said on that stream, and that Tim and Lydia didn't take me seriously, or Jonathan, and that's fine. No one's obligated to take me seriously. The trouble is that, of course, a lot of the other scholars do take me seriously, and so by bluffing me off or pretending that I did, not pretending, but making assumptions about my level of knowledge on these topics made some of their responses seem a little bit trite. And so I'm not convinced that it's worth me responding and getting basically into name calling, even though that may seem like what I'm doing here. It's not. I'm hoping I'm not, because I respect them as scholars. They just weren't responding directly to things that I was saying, so I'm not sure there's much point in trying to respond to stuff I wasn't saying. But excellent question. I do need to watch the full thing sometime with a little bit of time passed. I would encourage everyone else to watch it and make up your own mind. Don't take my word for it. See if that's how you read the situation too. Heathen Queen. One of my favorites just in general. Just here to tell G-Man to get pegged. Yay! That's a very Heathen Queen thing to say. If you don't follow Heathen Queen's channel here on our TikTok, fix that right now. And when this is done, if you still need to stay up later, she and I had a couple of streams and some highlights of those streams. You can find Heathen Queen on this channel. Mr. Monster for $2. Humans cannot come back to life after being dead. Generally, I would agree. I would say, though, that if there is a God that wanted to raise people from the dead, if there was a creator God in the way the Christians described it, that would be possible. It's just that we don't have any evidence for it, and history, or more specifically eyewitness testimony, would never be enough to verify that. You would need further evidence. First of all, that they'd really died, and second of all, that they really were alive. Eyewitness testimony is always going to be, it's always going to be more likely that the person is lying or mistaken than that an incredible miracle is the only natural conclusion. So, or the only, shouldn't say natural conclusion, the only conclusion. I don't know why theists don't put lying or mistaken on the table when they do for all other religions. But again, that's that outsider test thing. But yeah, appreciate the super chat. I agree that certainly within the natural realm, they can't come to life. And I think we're on our last one. Brendan Kyer writes, after dozens of hours of binging your content, I'm finally able to make a live stream. That's because I did it a weird hour probably. Best way to spend a Sunday night. Well, I appreciate that, Brendan. I appreciate all of you for hanging with me, whether it was the whole time or part of the time. This was fun and cathartic for me, something I've been wanting to do for a while, just to get out of my system. This wasn't the most serious. I hope that everyone understood that the nature of this one was going to be a little less serious than I normally take. Not because G-Man's not a serious person. That's not what I mean to imply at all. I just don't think that was maybe his best work. Or at least, it wasn't the kind of thing that a Christian should say was a shining example of a defense of the resurrection. It was just basically affirming what the Bible says. And I'm glad I had my For the Bible Tells Me So button working. And it seems like I got one more super chat here from, I think, Zamdes. Is that how I say it? I hallucinated a 4-dimensional star once. I don't know how I know, but I know. It's terrible logic, but I feel that if everyone knows God exists, it would be something similar to that. 11:22 here in Cali. Yeah, I miss living in Cali when all the events of the East Coast people was happening early in the evening and you still had a whole evening to go do your own stuff. Missed that. But I like living on the East Coast as well. Great things about it. Anyway, thank you so much for that super chat. Yeah, I agree. If it's just intuition that we're supposed to take, I guess, I don't have the same intuitions. Anyway. With that, I think clearly the caffeine that I've been drinking the whole stream here is not kicking in fully, so I'm going to end this before I fall asleep on stream. Thank you so much for watching, and check out the other videos on the channel if you're still interested in more. Check out the original with G-Man. Let him know what you think, and until next time, later.